It was raining so hard the sky itself seemed angry. My daughter stood tied to a tree, her hair drenched, her small wrists struggling against the rope. In front of her stood Karen's son, his eyes filled with cruel pride as he shouted through the storm, "Call your dad! Let's see if he can save you now!" The wind howled, thunder cracked, and my little girl just stood there, terrified, shaking, tears mixing with the rain. But what he didn't know was who her father really was. Please subscribe for support and comment me. Where are you watching from? Let's start. It happened on a night when the sky didn't just cry, it roared. The kind of storm that makes windows tremble and hearts tighten. My name's Nate Walker, and that night, my world tilted in a way I'll never forget. My 14-year-old daughter Isabel was supposed to be just 2 streets away, safe, warm, and laughing with friends. But fate, and one cruel choice, decided otherwise. When I tell people this story, they often ask when I knew something was wrong. It wasn't the lightning or the thunder shaking the ground, it was the silence. That strange, heavy silence that creeps in before everything falls apart. My wife Heather felt it too. She stood by the window, eyes fixed on the rain-streaked glass, her reflection trembling in it like a ghost. "She's not answering," she whispered. 3 words, soft enough to vanish in the storm, but sharp enough to slice through me. There's a kind of stillness a man learns to live with when he's seen too much chaos. I'm not the kind who yells or breaks things. When things explode, I get quieter. It's how I've learned to survive. But that night, my quiet came with a weight. The air itself felt wrong, like the world was holding its breath. We lived in Birchfield Meadows, a place that looked like it came straight out of a postcard. Fresh-cut lawns, matching mailboxes, polite smiles. But every perfect picture has a shadow. Ours wore the name Karen Goodson. She ran the Homeowners Association like a kingdom, her rules written in venom and her pride stitched into every threat she mailed. And her son Brody, well, he thought that made him a prince. I never hated the boy. I just knew what he was growing into. Entitlement wrapped in a Letterman jacket. A smirk that dared you to say something. I'd seen that kind before. The ones who think the world bends for them because they've never been told it won't. That night, the storm rolled in, thick and violent. The wind howled, the rain came sideways, and the trees swayed like giants trying to stay upright. At 9:15, Heather's voice cracked the silence again. She should have been home. Her eyes met mine, and in that gaze, wet, scared, and tired, I saw every parent's nightmare reflected back. It wasn't loud panic. It was the kind that tightens your chest until breathing hurts. Then the phone buzzed. Isabel's name flashed on the screen. For 1 second, the world paused. I hit speaker. "Izzy?" Her voice came through the storm, small, broken, shaking. "Nate, I'm in the field." The flashlight in my hand became the only thing keeping me from falling apart. Heather grabbed the other, her hands trembling as she called 911. "We're coming, sweetheart," I told her. "Just hold on." She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just whispered, "He tied me to the tree." You never forget words like that. They don't echo, they carve. Every father knows what it means to protect his child. But in that moment, protection wasn't enough. I needed to save her. We ran out the door into the storm. The wind slammed against us, the rain slicing like tiny blades. The flashlights cut small tunnels of light through the darkness. Every step through the mud felt like a battle. And then, there it was. A flicker of blue. Her jacket. Isabel was bound to the old cottonwood tree, the same tree that shaded the common ground behind our house every summer. A tree that once meant life, laughter, neighborhood picnics. That night, it became a monument of cruelty. The rope dug into her skin. Her hair was plastered to her face, her lips pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. "The bark is eating me," she chattered. Her voice cracked with cold and fear. I pressed my shoulder against the trunk and started cutting through the rope. The knife felt useless against the thick, wet fibers. The wind howled louder, as if the storm itself wanted to drown out her cries. "Hold still, Izzy," I said. She tried to laugh, a weak, trembling sound. "Next time, text me. No trees." I smiled through the tears burning in my eyes. Deal. When the last rope snapped, she collapsed into Heather's arms. The storm didn't stop. It just became background noise. I wrapped my jacket around her shivering body, whispering, "You're safe now. You're okay." But deep down, I knew nothing about this was okay. As we carried her home, I looked back at that tree. The lightning flashed, and for a second I thought I saw them. Shadows standing at the far edge of the field watching. Brody and his friends. They didn't move. They didn't help. They just watched, and then they vanished into the rain. Inside the house, Isabel sat wrapped in blankets. Heather held her close, her hands shaking, her face streaked with tears and rain. I made her hot chocolate because that's what dads do when they can't fix things. They reach for warmth, for small comforts. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking. My mind was already somewhere else. I kept thinking of the rope, the knots, the way it had cut into her wrists. That rope, it wasn't just a weapon. It was a message, a symbol of control, a way to say you're powerless. But they'd tied the wrong girl to that tree, and they'd forgotten who she called Dad. While the world outside still thundered, I heard Heather whisper, "She called him too." "Who?" I asked. Her eyes lifted to meet mine. "Her father." And in that moment, the storm outside wasn't the only one we had to face. Because Isabel's biological dad, Mark, wasn't a man who waited for justice. He was a man who delivered it. That was the moment everything changed. The calm before the real storm. Sometimes the world breaks you with noise. Sometimes it breaks you with silence. And sometimes it sends you a call that forces every truth out into the open. That night, under the shadow of that old cottonwood, something in me cracked. But something in Isabel began to awaken too. Pain and rebirth often share the same heartbeat. If you've ever felt helpless, if you've ever wanted to scream but couldn't, you'll understand what that night really was. It wasn't just about cruelty. It was about power, pride, and what happens when love is pushed past its limits. Before it's over, you'll see that storms don't just destroy, they reveal. And trust me, when the man she called Dad arrived, the wind itself seemed to stop and listen. The storm had passed by morning, but the silence it left behind was worse than the thunder. The rain had cleaned the streets, yet everything still smelled like fear. Heather sat at the kitchen counter, hands around a mug she hadn't sipped. Isabel was asleep upstairs, her body wrapped in warmth, but her soul still trembling. The cuts on her wrists were small, but the mark they left on our hearts was deep. I watched the steam rise from my own cup, curling like smoke from a fire that hadn't fully died. There are moments when you think the worst is behind you, but deep down, you know the real storm hasn't even begun. Heather's phone buzzed on the counter. She didn't look at it. She didn't have to. We both knew who it was. Mark, Isabel's biological father. The man she'd called from that tree. The man who had spent 20 years learning how to end danger, not talk about it. When the phone rang again, I answered. "Nate?" His voice came through the line like gravel and gunpowder. "Where is she?" "She's home." "She's safe," I said, keeping my voice calm. "She's cold, but she's fine." There was a pause, a silence so heavy it seemed to slow the air around me. Then I heard the low growl of a truck engine on the other end. "I'm 10 minutes out," he said. And before I could explain that the police were already involved, the line went dead. 10 minutes. That's how long it takes for a man like Mark to turn a storm into a war. Heather looked at me. No words, just a look that said everything. Fear, love, exhaustion. "He's coming," I said quietly. She closed her eyes. Then you know what happens next. I did. I'd seen it before. Mark was a man who believed in swift justice, not slow forgiveness. He loved Isabel fiercely, and he protected her like the world owed him blood for every tear she ever shed. I stood by the window and saw the first flash of headlights cutting through the rain. The rumble grew louder until the Ford F-250 screeched to a stop outside the Goodsons' house, 2 doors down. Karen Goodson's porch light flicked on. Of course it did. The Queen had heard the drums of war outside her castle. Heather grabbed my arm. Nate, stop him. I didn't answer. I just ran. The cold hit me like a wall as I stepped outside. Rain dripped from the gutters and my shoes sank into the soaked grass. Mark was already out of his truck, walking straight across Karen's perfect lawn. He wasn't tall, but every step carried the weight of a man who knew what damage his hands could do. Brody stood on the porch beside his mother, his varsity jacket bright even in the dark. He smirked. That same smirk Isabel had described through tears. Karen crossed her arms, looking offended instead of afraid. Can I help you? She called out. Boys will be boys, Mr. Walker. Maybe your little girl should learn some consequences. That's when the air broke. Mark didn't shout. He didn't curse. He just stared at Brody like a man measuring his next breath. You put your hands on my daughter. It wasn't a question. It was a sentence. Brody's grin faltered. It was just a joke, man. That one line sealed his fate. Mark moved before anyone could blink. 2 strides, 1 grab, 1 hit. His fist connected with Brody's jaw, a clean, precise strike, born from decades of muscle memory. The sound of it, one sharp, sickening crack, cut through the night louder than the thunder ever did. Brody dropped instantly, like a puppet with its strings cut. Karen screamed. One of Brody's friends rushed forward, but Mark spun, caught his arm, and twisted it behind his back until the boy cried out. A sheriff's deputy finally arrived, red and blue lights flashing against the rain-soaked walls. Hands behind your back, the deputy shouted. Mark obeyed, calm, silent. His expression didn't change. He didn't look at Karen, he didn't argue. He just looked at me, one small nod. A message I'll never forget. I did my part. Now do yours. As the deputy cuffed him, Karen pointed at me, her eyes burning with triumph. You'll pay for this. All of you! That was the moment I realized the real battle wasn't in the rain. It was in the daylight. By morning, the story had already changed. Karen had called the police, filed reports, and sent emails to the entire neighborhood claiming her son was brutally attacked by a violent ex-military lunatic. She left out the part about her son tying a 14-year-old girl to a tree during a thunderstorm. The media didn't come. The neighbors didn't speak. Most just drew their curtains a little tighter. Inside our house, the weight of guilt and anger pressed against every wall. Isabel barely spoke. She sat on the couch with her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the same cup of cocoa she'd been holding since dawn. It's my fault, she whispered. If I hadn't called him... Heather kneeled beside her. No, baby. You didn't call a monster. You called your dad. But even she couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. Mark's punch had consequences, and Karen Goodson was going to squeeze every drop of power she could from it. Later that night, as the rain returned in a slow drizzle, we heard glass shatter. The sound came from Isabel's room. We ran upstairs. The window was broken. A brick lay on the floor wrapped in a muddy piece of rope. The same kind of rope that had tied her to the tree. The message was clear. We know where you sleep. It's strange how fear doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. The deputy who came to take the report looked young enough to still believe the world was mostly fair. He glanced at the window, took some photos, and shrugged. Probably just kids. I held up the brick. These aren't kids. This is a warning. He nodded, gave me a case number, and drove off. That night, Heather and I sat in Isabel's room, sweeping up glass and writing everything down. Date, time, incident. It became the first page of what we would later call the harassment log. Every threat, every scare tactic, every reminder that Karen Goodson thought she was untouchable. We wrote it all down. But behind my calm, something darker was brewing. Mark's way had been raw and explosive. Mine was going to be quiet and sharp. I wasn't going to fight Karen with fists. I was going to bury her with truth. Our chance came the next morning when our neighbor Dan showed up. He was retired Army Signal Corps, a man who understood patterns, systems, and secrets. He'd seen everything that night. He'd watched the flashing lights, the arrest, and the fallout. He put down a plate of cookies and said, "Karen's been a tyrant for years, but this is different." We told him everything. About the rope, the threats, the brick. Dan listened carefully, his eyes narrowing the more we talked. Then he said one thing that changed everything. The pool house. The security system. She installed it last year herself. He explained how every camera in the neighborhood fed back to one recorder in the clubhouse, a system Karen controlled completely. If Brody and his friends were in the common area that night, those cameras might have caught everything. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a chance. That night, with Dan watching the street from his window, I slipped into the pool house. The keypad code was easy. People like Karen never think anyone's brave enough to test them. Inside, I found the recorder humming quietly. I cloned the hard drive and slipped out unnoticed. When we played the footage back on my laptop, the truth spilled out on the screen in grainy gray images. Isabel, tied to the tree. Brody and his friends, laughing, filming, leaving her there in the rain. The timestamp glowed like proof carved in light. Heather's hand covered her mouth. A single tear rolled down her cheek. "We got them," she whispered. But then Dan scrolled further, and what we found made the air in the room vanish. The system didn't just record the pool area. There were folders for every street in the neighborhood. Live feeds, our house, Dan's porch, everyone's homes. Karen Goodson wasn't just a control freak. She was running her own private surveillance network, spying on every family she ruled over. I stared at the screen, speechless. The woman who had called us criminals was the one committing crimes right under everyone's noses. That discovery was more than just evidence. It was a loaded gun pointed at her empire. But it was dangerous for us, too. We had obtained it illegally, and if we handled it wrong, we could go down with her. Heather, calm but fierce, made the plan. We used the footage of Isabel and the email where she told Brody to teach her a lesson. We keep the rest hidden until the right time. That night, I looked out the window toward the Goodson house. The porch light was on, as always. Karen loved her light. It was her symbol of control, her silent reminder that she watched everything. But this time I smiled. Because the light that made her feel powerful was the same light that was about to expose her. The truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits in the shadows, until someone brave enough turns the power back on. And as I stood there, watching the rain slide off the roof and pool in the grass, I realized this fight wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance, about justice. And Karen Goodson had no idea that her kingdom of vinyl siding and HOA fines was about to collapse, starting with her own son. The next morning, the neighborhood felt heavier, as if the air itself had learned to keep secrets. Heather and I sat at the dining table, staring at the laptop screen. The footage from the pool house was still open. The moment Isabel had been tied to the tree, replaying again and again. Every time my throat tightened. Every time I wanted to smash the computer. But I didn't. I just sat there, quiet. my hands gripping the table until my knuckles went white. Isabel walked into the room wrapped in a blanket. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but she looked stronger somehow, like she'd seen the world for what it really was. "Did you find them?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. I didn't have to. She saw it in my face. Heather gently touched her hand. "We did, sweetheart. We've got proof, but now we have to be careful." That word, careful, felt small compared to what I was feeling inside. Because the more I looked at that screen, the more I knew I wasn't just going to defend my family. I was going to destroy the people who thought we were weak. We watched as Dan came over again, bringing his same quiet calm with him. He had that military stillness, like a man who'd seen everything and learned to pick his battles wisely. He poured himself a cup of coffee and said, "You've got gold here, Nate, but gold can burn too. You can't just hand this over. It'll get tossed if it's tied to trespassing." He was right. The footage we'd taken could turn on us if it wasn't handled carefully. Heather leaned forward, tapping her fingers against the table. "Then we need to use their own rules against them. We play by the book. We don't lose our tempers. We use facts." I nodded, though my chest was burning. Every part of me wanted to march to Karen's house, show her the footage, and make her watch it. But that wasn't how this war would be won. Not with fists, not with anger. This time it had to be with strategy. That night, the three of us sat together again, going over every file from the hard drive. It was a maze of folders, timestamps, and camera angles. And then, buried deep within one of the email folders, Heather found it. An email Karen had sent to her son the day before the storm. The subject line read, "Isabel Walker." The message was short, but it hit like a hammer. "Brody, it's time that girl learned a lesson about respecting her elders. Be smart about it. Make sure she understands." Heather read it out loud, her voice breaking halfway through. Isabel covered her face with her hands. I felt something twist inside me. This wasn't just bullying. This was a woman using her own child to hurt mine. It's hard to imagine how far some people will go just to feel powerful. We sat in silence for a long time. The house creaked, the fridge hummed, and the weight of that email seemed to press against our lungs. That's when Heather looked at me and said, "You know what she's going to do next, right? She's going to spin this. She'll play the victim just like she always does. We can't let her control the story again." She was right. Karen's power didn't come from rules, it came from fear. And she ruled the neighborhood by making people afraid to speak up. I'd seen that kind of control before. It was the same thing men like Mark had been trained to fight against. But Mark's fight was over for now. He was behind bars waiting for his hearing. Ours was just beginning. Later that night, when Heather went upstairs to check on Isabel, I stayed at the kitchen table staring at the laptop screen. I played the video one more time. The rain, the ropes, my daughter's voice cracking through the wind. Something inside me broke quietly. I pressed my palms against the table and closed my eyes. I thought about Mark, about the punch, about the blood, about how quickly everything spiraled. I'd told myself I was the calm one, the rational one. But sitting there, with proof that Karen had sent her son to terrorize my daughter, I realized calm had limits too. I walked outside and stood under the same sky where it all happened. The cottonwood tree stood tall and silent in the distance. Its branches swayed lightly in the wind, whispering the same question that had haunted me since that night. How far would you go to protect your family? Every parent says they'd do anything, but most never learn what anything really means. The next day, Heather made the first move. She called a lawyer, a friend of a friend, someone who knew how to deal with HOA disputes and harassment cases. The call didn't give us the comfort we hoped for. The lawyer told us that since Karen was the acting president, any formal complaint would go straight through her office. She could delay it, bury it, or twist it to make us look like the aggressors. So we changed tactics. Instead of going to her, we went to the courthouse. We filed for a temporary protection order against Brody. The paperwork was thick and cold, but the moment the judge signed it, something inside me shifted. It wasn't victory. It was preparation. The order meant Brody couldn't come near Isabel. Not within 500 feet of her, our house, or her school. It was a wall of paper, but it was still a wall. We went home that evening and tried to breathe. Isabel looked lighter, almost hopeful. "So he can't come near me anymore?" she asked. Heather nodded. "That's right, honey. He can't. But part of me didn't believe it. Karen's family didn't follow rules. They wrote them. That same night, Isabel asked if she could go to the skate park the next weekend. Skating had always been her escape, the one thing that made her feel free. I hesitated. The thought of her out there alone made my chest ache. But Heather placed a hand on my shoulder. "We can't take everything from her," she said. "She needs to feel strong again." So we agreed. But not without a plan. Dan brought over a modified AirTag, a tracking device he'd customized himself. He'd removed the speaker and extended the range. "You put this on her board," he said. "If anyone touches it, you'll know." We hid it under a sticker on the bottom of her old skateboard, the same one she'd had since she was 10. It was scratched and faded, but it was hers. That board had seen every fall, every scrape, every laugh, and now it would become bait. Saturday came. Isabel stood by the car holding her skateboard, her fingers tracing the worn sticker near the wheel. I saw it then, the symbolic connection. The same hands that had once been tied now held her freedom again. We drove her to the skate park. She smiled at us before stepping out. "If I fall," she said with a grin, "I'm blaming gravity." Heather and I sat in separate cars, watching from a distance, both pretending to be calm. For 20 minutes, everything was normal. She skated, laughed with friends, and even took a break by the bench. But then, a black pickup truck pulled into the lot. Brody. My heart sank. He didn't get out right away. He just sat there watching. Then one of his friends got out, Kevin, the same kid who'd been there that night. He walked toward the bench where Isabel's board rested. He looked around, smirked, and picked it up. On my phone screen, the AirTag dot started moving. Slowly, then faster. Away from the park, down the road, into our subdivision, straight to the community clubhouse. I called the sheriff's office immediately. The deputy who showed up was the same one from the brick incident, bored, young, unimpressed. But this time, when he saw the live tracker moving inside the locked clubhouse, his tone changed. He waited outside with me just as the door opened, and Brody and Kevin stepped out. They weren't carrying the board. "Hold up, boys," the deputy said. His voice was suddenly firm. Brody froze. "We were just hanging out," he said quickly. The deputy went inside. A moment later, he came back holding Isabel's skateboard. Then he held up Kevin's phone, showing a text from Brody. "Grab the board. That's all it took." The deputy cuffed Brody on the spot. Karen's SUV screeched into the parking lot moments later, headlights flashing, horn blaring. She jumped out, screaming threats at everyone in sight. But this time, the law didn't care who she was. The deputy just shut the car door and drove away, with Brody inside. As the taillights disappeared, Karen stood there under the harsh white street lamp, alone, shaking, her face contorted with rage. I watched her from across the lot. She didn't look powerful anymore. She looked cornered. But that scared me more than anything, because people like her don't surrender. They plot. That night, back at home, I finally allowed myself to breathe. Isabel was safe. Heather was resting, and for the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel haunted. But when I went outside to lock the shed, I saw something that stopped me cold. A small package sat on the doorstep. No label, no note. I opened it slowly, and inside was a coil of rope. The same kind they'd used on Isabel. The message was clear again. It wasn't over. Sometimes when you think you've won, that's when the real game begins. That night I didn't sleep. I just sat on the porch staring at that rope. It sat on the table in front of me, coiled neatly like a snake waiting to strike again. The porch light flickered above me, and in its glow, that piece of rope felt alive, breathing, mocking, daring me to react. Heather came outside, her hair loose and her face pale with exhaustion. She looked down at the rope and whispered, "They're not done." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. We both knew Karen Goodson wasn't the kind of woman who gave up when her pride was wounded. She'd lost control for the first time in her life, and people like her, people who built their power on fear, always try to take it back. Heather sat beside me quietly, her hand finding mine. "We have to be smarter than her," she said softly. "No rage this time. No mistakes. We fight with truth." But truth felt small against what we were facing. I could see it in her eyes, too. The fear wasn't just about what Karen might do. It was about how far she might go. By morning, the neighborhood had turned colder. You could feel it in the stares, the whispers, the doors that didn't open when we passed. Karen had already sent another email to every homeowner, claiming Brody's arrest was a setup orchestrated by our family. She said Isabel had planted evidence and called us vindictive troublemakers. She even hinted that we were recording people without consent. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so. Cruel. Heather printed the email and pinned it to the fridge like a target. "She's scared," she said flatly. And scared people lie loudest. Still, fear spreads faster than truth. By noon, our phones buzzed with messages from neighbors. Some offered support. Most stayed silent. A few just said, "Don't drag us into this." Karen's influence was rotting through the community like mold behind wallpaper, quiet, hidden, but everywhere. That afternoon, a knock at the door startled us. It was Uncle Dan, his face grim, a flash drive in his hand. "We need to talk," he said. We sat him down, and he placed the drive gently on the table. "I didn't mean to dig this deep," he said, his voice low. "But when I looked through the rest of the data, there's more." He plugged it into the laptop. The files loaded slowly, one after another, until we saw folders named after every street in Birchfield Meadows. It was the same discovery we'd made before, but this time, Dan opened the hidden subfolders. Inside were hundreds of clips, dozens of families, kids playing in their yards, couples arguing on porches. Karen had been spying on everyone, day and night for months. Heather's jaw clenched. She didn't just want control. She wanted to own them. I scrolled through the footage, my stomach turning with every new file. "She's been watching Isabel since before the storm," I said quietly. She knew where she went. What time she left school. Everything. That was the moment I realized we weren't just fighting a neighbor. We were fighting a system built on fear. Heather leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "If we go public with this footage, we could expose her, but we could also go down for how we got it." She looked at me then, searching for the answer in my silence. "So what do we do?" I didn't know yet. But I did know one thing. The truth was bigger than our fear now. We couldn't hide behind safety anymore. That night, Heather sat on the edge of Isabel's bed, brushing her hair back as she slept. I stood in the doorway, watching. Heather whispered, "She's starting to smile again." Her voice cracked slightly. "I can't let Karen take that away." Later, when Heather fell asleep, I went back downstairs and stared at that rope again. I picked it up, feeling the rough texture scrape against my skin. I imagined Brody's laughter, Karen's smug voice, Isabel's trembling hands. My chest filled with a rage so sharp it scared me. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was ready. The next day, Heather found me pacing by the window. "You're thinking about confronting her," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. She's not going to stop, I said. She's already crossed every line. Heather stepped closer. If you go over there, she'll twist it. She'll make you the villain like she did with Mark. She was right, but something inside me had shifted. I'd spent my life trying to be calm, rational, patient. But there's a point where patience turns into surrender, and I was done surrendering. Before I could say another word, a familiar sound came from outside, a car engine idling too long. I looked out the window and saw Karen's SUV parked across the street. She was sitting in the driver's seat staring straight at our house. I opened the door and stepped out. Her window rolled down halfway. "Mr. Walker!" she called out, her voice sweet with venom. "How's your little actress doing? Still pretending to be a victim?" I took a step closer. "You should leave." "Oh, I'm not leaving," she said, smiling coldly. "You think you've won? You think your little stunt with the police means anything? You broke the law. You trespassed. You stole data. I could have you arrested by morning." I met her gaze and said quietly, "Then do it." She blinked, surprised by my calm. "I dare you," I continued, "because if I go down, I'll take every file, every video, every email with me. The whole neighborhood will see what you really are." Her smile faltered for just a second, and in that second I saw it, the flicker of fear behind her confidence. She rolled the window up and drove off without another word. Heather came out a moment later. "What did you do?" "Nothing," I said. "I just told her the truth." But deep down, I knew that wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the real fight. Sometimes, silence isn't peace. It's just the deep breath before the explosion. The explosion came 2 nights later. It was just past midnight when Isabel screamed. I ran into her room and saw it immediately, the window wide open, the curtains flapping. On the floor, next to her bed, was a photo of her from a school event. Someone had taken it, torn it in half, and left it there. Heather grabbed Isabel, holding her tight. "It's okay, baby. It's okay." But it wasn't. Whoever had done this hadn't just broken a window. They'd broken the one thing we still had, our sense of safety. We called the police again. Same routine, flashlights, questions, not enough answers. But this time, I didn't just file another report. I gave them a copy of the footage from the pool house, the one showing Brody and his friends tying Isabel to the tree. The deputy looked uncomfortable, but took it. "We'll escalate this," he said. "You might want to stay somewhere else for a few days." But this was our home, and I wasn't running. The next morning, Heather woke me early. She was sitting at the table with the HOA binder open in front of her. "I found something," she said. Her voice was shaking with adrenaline. "There's a rule here, Article 3, Section 4. If 10% of homeowners sign a petition, they can force a special meeting of the HOA. That means Karen can't stop it. Not even her board can override it. For the first time in weeks, I felt hope. How many signatures do we need?" 25, she said. So that's what we did. We went door to door, one house at a time. Some people shut the door on us. Some whispered, "She'll find out." But others, tired, fed up, brave, signed their names. A young couple who Karen had fined for tire marks. An old woman whose roses were ruled non-compliant. A family whose graduation sign she'd confiscated. Every name on that list was another spark against the dark. By the end of the weekend, we had 38. We walked into the HOA office that Monday morning, laid the stack of petitions on the desk, and walked out without saying a word. The rule was clear. They had 30 days to hold the meeting. The moment we stepped outside, Heather exhaled shakily. "This is it," she said. "This is the line we can't uncross." She was right. That night, after Isabel went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the stack of papers on the counter. I could feel the weight of what was coming pressing down on me. Karen would fight back harder than ever. She'd try to twist everything again, but this time, the truth wasn't hiding anymore. Still, a quiet voice inside me whispered the question I didn't want to face. What if we lose? I closed my eyes and thought about Mark, the man sitting behind bars because he couldn't hold back his anger. I thought about Isabel, the way her voice had cracked when she said, "He tied me to the tree." And I thought about Heather, the woman who somehow kept all of us standing when everything else was falling apart. If we failed, all of it would be for nothing. I got up and walked to the window. Outside, the wind had picked up again. The old cottonwood tree swayed gently in the moonlight. The same tree that had once held my daughter prisoner now stood tall and silent, a witness to everything. The next move would be Karen's. And I knew, deep down, she wouldn't go quietly. When truth finally threatens power, power doesn't surrender, it strikes. The following days felt stretched thin, like time itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Every sound outside made my heart jump. Every email notification made Heather tense. Isabel was quieter too, her laughter replaced by long silences. She'd sit near the window, sketching shapes on the fogged glass, lost somewhere between fear and exhaustion. The HOA meeting had been announced, Wednesday at 7 p.m., buried in the middle of a long, boring newsletter about pool maintenance and lawn regulations. Karen's tactic was clear. She wanted to keep people away. She wanted to bury the truth under paperwork and fine print. But Heather was 2 steps ahead. She printed flyers, simple and bold. Forced HOA meeting. Come hear the truth about Karen Goodson. We went door to door again, this time not to collect signatures but to spread the word. Some people took the flyers in silence. Others thanked us quietly at their doors, their voices trembling as they said, "About time." The fear was still there, but so was something new. Courage. Uncle Dan helped too. He went around handing out flyers with that calm, steady confidence only men like him carry. He knew everyone, and everyone trusted him. "I've lived here 23 years, he told one neighbor. It's time this place belonged to decent people again. But on the eve of the meeting, something happened that changed everything. I was in the garage late that night, checking over the flash drives that held copies of the footage and emails. Heather was upstairs with Isabel. The house was quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it. A faint knock at the side door. Not the front, the side. The one near the garage. When I opened it, I froze. Dan was standing there, his coat zipped up, his expression unreadable. He looked different, tired, distant. "We need to talk," he said. I nodded and let him in. He didn't sit down. He just stood there, looking at the flash drive in my hand. "You shouldn't take that to the meeting tomorrow," he said. I frowned. "What do you mean?" He exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. "I've been thinking, Nate, maybe this is going too far. Maybe we've already done enough damage." "Damage?" I repeated. "Dan, they tied my daughter to a tree. Karen's been spying on the whole neighborhood." He didn't meet my eyes. "I know, but if this goes public, it won't just be her that burns. Everyone will, including me." That's when it hit me. The security footage, the camera feeds. Dan had been in on the installation. He'd told us he saw the installer punch in the code. But what if he wasn't just watching? What if he had helped set it up? My chest tightened. "Dan, what did you do?" He finally looked up at me. "She came to me a year ago," he said quietly. "Said she wanted a few outdoor cameras installed to prevent vandalism. She paid me to help. I didn't know she'd use it like this." My hands shook. "You wired her system," he nodded. "I thought it was just for the clubhouse and the pool. But then she added more cameras. Said it was for community safety. I should have stopped her." "Why didn't you?" He swallowed hard. "Because she threatened me, Nate. She said she'd have my pension audited. Said she'd ruin me. I was stupid. I thought if I kept my head down, she'd forget. It's always the people you trust the most who hold the pieces you never saw coming. I wanted to be angry, but I couldn't. Dan wasn't the enemy. He was another one of her victims, trapped, scared, ashamed. He took a deep breath. If that footage gets out, it'll expose that I worked on the system. She'll spin it against me, say I helped her spy on everyone. I ran a hand through my hair. So what? You tell the truth. He shook his head slowly. The truth doesn't always matter, Nate, not when people like her control the story. I stared at him, torn between gratitude and betrayal. He had helped us so much, but now, right when we were close to ending this nightmare, he was backing away. Dan, I said quietly, we can't back down now. She's crossed the line. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about every family she's hurt. He looked at me for a long time, then nodded once. Then we finish it, he said. But after tomorrow, nothing will ever be the same. When he left, I sat alone in the garage for a long time. His words echoed in my head. Nothing will ever be the same. He was right. The next morning, Heather was already awake, sitting at the table surrounded by printed documents, emails, timelines, police reports. She had the look of someone who'd already made peace with the storm coming her way. Are you ready for tonight? She asked. Ready, I said, but inside, I wasn't. Inside, I was terrified. By evening, the clubhouse parking lot was full. People who hadn't spoken to each other in months were standing shoulder to shoulder, whispering, waiting. The air buzzed with tension. Karen stood at the front of the room beside her board members, smiling her politician's smile. She wore pearls and a navy blazer like she was about to give a campaign speech. When she saw me walk in, her smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed. Mr. Walker, she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. So glad you could make it. I hope this little show doesn't take long. Heather took my hand under the table. Isabel sat in the back with a blanket around her shoulders. I could feel her watching me, trusting me to do the one thing I'd promised her. Make it stop. Karen started the meeting with her usual self-importance, rambling about HOA budgets, garden maintenance, and recent acts of neighborhood disturbance. Her tone was calm, controlled. She was setting the stage to make us look like the villains. Then she paused and said, Before we continue, I'd like to remind everyone that this meeting is about unity, not revenge. That was it. That was her plan, to make this sound petty. To make our pain sound like gossip, I stood up. My name is Nate Walker, I said, my voice firm but steady. And this isn't about revenge. This is about truth. The room went silent. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. Heather handed me the small microphone we'd brought, and Uncle Dan, sitting near the back, connected his laptop to the projector. The lights dimmed slightly as the first image appeared on the screen, a picture of Isabel smiling in the sunlight. Then came the video. The room changed in seconds. The laughter stopped. The whispers died. Everyone stared as the grainy footage showed Brody and his friends dragging Isabel toward the tree. The ropes, the storm, her trembling voice, the timestamp flashing proof. Karen's face drained of color. She slammed her hand on the table. That's fake. That's fabricated. Heather stood up, her voice sharp and clear. Is this fake too? She held up a printed copy of the email, Karen's message to Brody. It's time that girl learned a lesson about respecting her elders. The crowd erupted. People shouted. Some gasped. A man in the back yelled, You said my wife's roses were illegal. Another woman cried, You fined me $200 for parking my car facing the wrong way. The room was breaking apart, the mask finally slipping. Karen looked like she wanted to melt into the floor. Truth doesn't always whisper. It roars when it's been buried too long. just as she opened her mouth to speak, the doors at the back burst open. Two sheriff's deputies walked in with Detective Miller, the same detective who'd been assigned to Mark's case. The entire room froze. Detective Miller's voice carried across the chaos. "Karen Goodson," she said firmly. "We have a warrant to seize HOA property, including financial records and digital equipment." Karen stumbled backward, stammering. You can't do this! This is harassment!" The detective didn't flinch. "You're under investigation for illegal surveillance, harassment, and possible misuse of HOA funds." Karen's board members started whispering to each other, their eyes wide with fear. For the first time, Karen wasn't the one in control. But before anyone could process what was happening, another sound cut through the tension, slow clapping. It came from the back of the room. Mark. He was standing there in a clean white shirt, his jaw still bruised from the night of his arrest. I hadn't even noticed him come in. He walked slowly toward the front, eyes locked on Karen. The entire crowd watched in stunned silence. Karen froze as he stopped just a few feet from her. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "You told your son to teach my daughter a lesson. I just came to thank you." She blinked, confused. "Thank me?" He nodded. "Yeah, because you reminded me what real monsters look like." The deputies took Karen by the arms as the room erupted again. Shouts, gasps, flashes from cell phones. But amid the chaos, something else happened. Dan stepped outside, away from the noise. I followed him, and when he turned to face me, I could see tears in his eyes. "She's gone," I said quietly. He nodded. "Yeah, but Nate, there's something you should know." I frowned. "What?" He hesitated, then handed me a folded piece of paper. "That hard drive you copied, it wasn't the only one. The moment you think you found the truth is the moment you realize it was only half of it." The wind was cold that night, the kind that carries silence heavier than noise. I stood under the old cottonwood tree again, the one that had seen every secret of this neighborhood, every scream, every tear. It was strange how quiet it felt now, almost peaceful, as if it knew the storm had reached its end. But deep inside me, something still trembled. Because even with Karen gone, the damage she caused still lingered like smoke after a fire. Heather came up behind me, wrapping her arms around my waist. "You okay?" she asked softly. I nodded, but my voice came out rough. "Dan said there's another drive." She sighed, her chin pressing into my shoulder. "Maybe it's nothing." But we both knew it wasn't. In stories like ours, maybe never means nothing. Later that night, we sat in the living room with Dan. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, his shoulders slumped, his eyes tired. He set the folded paper between us. "Karen kept a second hard drive hidden," he said. "A backup. I think she gave it to someone." "Who?" I asked. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Someone on the board. I'm not sure which one, but they're scared. They know if that drive surfaces, everything starts again." Heather looked down at her hands. "You mean this isn't over?" Dan's silence was the answer. Sometimes the worst part of a storm isn't when it hits. It's when you realize it left pieces behind. The next few days passed like we were living inside a ticking clock. Karen's arrest had shaken Birchfield Meadows to its core. News trucks came, neighbors whispered, and the community's perfect image crumbled. Some people apologized for not speaking up sooner. Others avoided eye contact entirely. But behind every polite nod, you could still feel the fear, the kind that doesn't vanish just because the villain's gone. One evening, as Heather made dinner and Isabel worked on homework, I sat on the porch with Dan again. He handed me a small thumb drive. "This isn't the drive," he said. "But it's something. One of the board members left it in my mailbox this morning. No note, just this." I took it carefully, feeling its weight. It was small, cold, harmless looking, Yet something told me it wasn't harmless at all. When I plugged it into the laptop later that night, the screen lit up with a single folder labeled HOA meeting recordings. Inside were dozens of audio files, meetings we'd never seen or heard before. Karen's voice filled the room, calm and commanding as always. "If they don't follow the rules," she said in one recording, "make them regret it." Then another voice spoke. A man's voice, familiar. Dan's. He flinched when he heard it again. "That was the first meeting," he said quietly. "I didn't say anything after that. I swear, but there was more." Karen's voice came through again. "We can't let Walker get comfortable here. His daughter's mouthy. Maybe a little discipline will teach them both some respect." Dan buried his face in his hands. "God forgive me," he whispered. "I should have walked out." Heather put a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't tie her to that tree," she said gently. "You're here now. That's what matters." But as I listened to that recording, something shifted in me. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about all of it. The silence, the people who looked away, the ones who let her power grow. Every single one of them had helped her build that empire of control, and I wasn't going to let it stand another day. We took the audio to Detective Miller the next morning. She listened quietly, expressionless, then said, "This confirms her intent. The DA's office will use it to strengthen the case. You just helped make sure she doesn't walk free." It should have felt like victory, but it didn't. Because Isabel still jumped every time she heard the wind. Heather still double-checked the locks at night. And I still woke up sweating, hearing her voice call for me from the field. Justice doesn't erase pain, it just gives it a name. 2 weeks later, the trial began. Karen sat at the defense table, pale and quiet, her once perfect hair now dull and lifeless. She didn't look like the monster we'd fought for months. She looked small, but that didn't fool anyone. Monsters come in all sizes. I sat in the front row with Heather and Isabel. Dan testified first. He admitted everything, his role in the camera installations, the threats she made, the fear that kept him silent. His voice broke near the end. "I should have stopped her," he said. "I'll live with that forever." Then came my turn. I walked to the stand, heart pounding. Karen wouldn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the table, pretending to be calm. I told the jury everything. The rope, the storm, the way Isabel's voice cracked when she called for help. I told them about the email, the spying, the lies. And when I looked toward the back of the courtroom, I saw something I didn't expect. Brody. He was sitting there, his head bowed, eyes red. He wasn't the cocky, smirking kid I remembered. He looked like a ghost. When I finished speaking, he stood up slowly and walked toward the judge. The courtroom murmured as he whispered something to his attorney. A few seconds later, the judge nodded and called him forward. Brody turned toward the jury and began to speak. His voice shook at first, but he kept going. "I did it," he said. "I tied Isabel to that tree. My mom told me she'd handle it if I listened. She said it was just a prank. But when she started screaming, I knew it wasn't." His voice broke. "I wanted to untie her. I swear I did. But she wouldn't let me. She said let her father find her." The room went silent. Karen's face went blank. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just sat there, her control finally gone. The judge ordered a brief recess. I walked past Brody on the way out. He didn't look at me, but he whispered something under his breath, barely audible. "I'm sorry." For the first time, I believed him. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't mean letting go, it means letting the truth finally breathe. When the trial ended, the verdict came quickly. Guilty, every charge. Karen was sentenced to years in prison. Brody was ordered into a rehabilitation program and community service. It wasn't perfect justice. It never is. But it was enough. After the sentencing, I went back to the cottonwood tree one last time. The air was still. the ground soft from the morning rain. I brought Isabel with me. She stood beside me quietly, her hand resting on the bark. "This tree saw everything," she said softly. "Yeah," I said, "but it also survived." She nodded slowly, tracing the rough texture of the trunk. "Maybe I can too." The wind rustled through the branches, and for the first time it didn't sound angry. It sounded alive. Healing. As we turned to leave, I noticed something sticking out of the dirt near the roots. A small black box, half buried. I reached down and pulled it free. It was a flash drive case, old, dirty, but real. My pulse quickened. Heather's voice echoed from behind us. "What's that?" I looked at the case in my hand and exhaled. Maybe the second drive. We stood there in silence. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the grass. It felt like the end, but also the beginning of something else. I didn't know what was on that drive. Maybe it was just more evidence. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe, just maybe, it held something we weren't ready to see yet. We didn't open it that day. We didn't need to. Some truths can wait. That night we ate dinner together, just the three of us. Isabel laughed again, really laughed for the first time in months. Heather smiled across the table, her eyes soft, her shoulders relaxed. For a moment, everything felt almost normal. Later, after Isabel went to bed, Heather and I stood on the porch watching the stars. She took my hand and said quietly, "Do you think it's really over?" I didn't answer right away. I just looked out at the dark field, the cottonwood standing tall in the distance, its leaves glowing faintly in the moonlight. Finally, I said, "Maybe not over, but maybe healed enough to start again." The wind blew gently through the trees, carrying away the last echoes of what had been. The pain, the fear, the anger, it all drifted off into the night. And somewhere in that silence, I heard Isabel's voice again, soft and steady. "Dad, I'm okay." I closed my eyes and smiled, because for the first time since that stormy night, I believed her. Months passed. The world outside the Walker home slowly found its rhythm again, but inside, nothing would ever be quite the same. Healing doesn't come in a rush. It creeps in quietly like sunlight through a cracked curtain. There were still moments when Isabel would wake from dreams she couldn't explain, clutching her blanket like she was still tied to that tree. Heather would hold her until her breathing slowed again, whispering the same words every time. "You're home. You're safe." The trial had ended, but the ripples kept spreading. Birchfield Meadows was no longer the postcard-perfect community it once pretended to be. For sale signs began appearing on manicured lawns. The HOA board was dissolved by a unanimous vote, and a new community council took its place. Neighbors who actually cared, not ruled. People started talking again. Doors opened. Fences, both wooden and emotional, began to come down. I still walked past the cottonwood every morning. It stood there, unbroken, older than any of us, its branches reaching higher each day. Sometimes I thought it was forgiving us all in its own quiet way. Other times I thought it was warning me, reminding me that peace can be fragile. Heather went back to her art studio. She'd started painting again, this time not for show, but for healing. Her canvases filled with storms, trees, and light cutting through clouds. Each painting was its own kind of prayer. Isabel began volunteering at a local youth shelter, helping kids who had been through bullying and trauma. Watching her smile again was like seeing spring bloom after a brutal winter. As for me, I rebuilt the old wooden fence around the yard. I didn't do it for security, I did it for grounding. Each nail I hammered felt like closure. Every plank was a reminder that rebuilding isn't about forgetting what broke, but choosing what to protect next. One evening, just before sunset, Uncle Dan came by. His health had been slipping, but his spirit hadn't. He stood by the tree with me for a while, saying nothing. Then he handed me an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "For Isabel," it said on the front. She should read it when she's ready, he murmured. It's my apology. The real one. I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. She'll understand, Dan. She already does. He smiled faintly. I hope so. You raised a good one, Nate. Then he turned to look at the horizon. This place, it finally feels honest. He left shortly after that, but his words stayed. Honest. That was what this fight had been about from the start. Not power, not pride, honesty. The truth, raw and painful, but real. The truth doesn't always set you free, but it always shows you who you are. Weeks later, the day came when Isabel finally wanted to open the small black flash drive we'd found buried by the tree. She sat with us at the table, hands trembling slightly as she clicked the file open. Inside was a folder labeled letters. They weren't Karen's, they were Brody's. Each file was a short note, written after the trial, sent but never delivered. In one he wrote, I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I think about that night every day. I don't even remember tying the knot. I remember the rain. I remember your eyes. And I remember feeling like I'd become someone I didn't want to be. Isabel stared at the screen for a long time before whispering, He's sorry. Heather nodded. That doesn't make it right, she said gently. I know, Isabel replied, but maybe it makes it real. We decided to print the letters, not to keep them as reminders of pain, but as proof that even people who break others can change if they face what they've done. Isabel folded the papers and placed them inside a small wooden box she painted herself. On the lid, she wrote one word: closure. That night, we went to the cottonwood together. Isabel buried the box beneath the roots, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed the soil down. When she finished, she stood back, brushed her palms together, and whispered, It's done. The wind moved through the branches, carrying her voice away. Heather slipped her arm through mine. You know, she said softly, for the first time in a long time, I don't feel afraid anymore. I looked at her, then at Isabel, our daughter, our fighter, the girl who had stared down cruelty and survived it. Me neither, I said. The three of us stood there as the sun dipped below the rooftops. The sky turned a soft shade of gold, then faded into twilight. The cottonwood swayed lightly, and for the briefest moment I swore I heard the echo of laughter in the wind. Not haunting, not painful, just free. Life after something like that doesn't go back to how it was. It becomes something new, stronger, quieter, truer. I started keeping a small journal after that. Not to relive what happened, but to remember how far we'd come. Some nights I'd write about the neighbors finally planting flowers together, about Heather's art being displayed at the local library, about Isabel laughing with her friends again, her voice loud, unafraid. And some nights I'd just sit on the porch, listening to the crickets and the soft hum of the night. There was no fear in the silence anymore, just peace. One evening, as I watched the sky fade to deep blue, Isabel came out and sat beside me. She leaned her head on my shoulder and said, You know, Dad, that tree's still growing. I smiled. Yeah, it is. Do you think it remembers? She asked. I looked toward the field where it stood, strong against the dusk. Maybe, I said, but if it does, I think it forgave us. She nodded, thoughtful. Then I'll forgive it too. It was such a small moment, but it hit me harder than any court verdict or apology ever could. Because forgiveness isn't about the person who hurt you. It's about taking back the part of yourself they tried to steal. Later, after she went inside, I stayed out a little longer. The stars were just beginning to appear, and the wind was calm. I thought about everything, the lies, the fear, the justice, the pain, and how somehow it had led us all right here. There's a strange kind of beauty in the scars left behind by storms. They don't disappear, but they remind you what you've survived. That night, before I went inside, I whispered something toward the tree. Just a few quiet words. Thank you for standing. The branches rustled in reply. And maybe, just maybe, that was its way of saying thank you too. In the end, what saves us isn't revenge, it's remembering that love is louder than fear. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows. Heather was humming while making breakfast. Isabel's laughter echoed from upstairs, and for once there were no police cars, no shouting, no tension in the air. Just normal life, beautiful, fragile, and real. When I stepped outside to grab the mail, I noticed something on the porch. A small folded note placed neatly under a smooth stone. I picked it up and opened it. It read, "You told the truth. Keep telling it, no signature, no return address. Just that." I smiled, folded it back up, and tucked it into my pocket. Because maybe that's what this was all for. Not just our story, but everyone's. To remind people that no matter how dark things get, truth will always find a way to breathe. So if you're listening to this right now, remember this: truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs someone brave enough to speak it. And if you believe stories like ours should be heard, share this one. Comment what this story made you feel. Subscribe to HOA Truth Tales and help me keep telling the stories most people are too afraid to say out loud. Because sometimes the smallest voice can bring down the loudest lie. And sometimes that's how healing begins. The storm didn't win. We did.